Hi, just to give you some information on our school and our school's context. So we're working in the UK independent day sector. The school that we're looking at is a co-educational school at secondary age, so that's 11 years old to the age of 18. In terms of our market, it's fairly competitive in the southwest of England. With regards to our current sector, UK independent, our parents are fairly demanding.
So if we pick up then on the necessity for a real clarity around strategic intent, I love this idea from the Hamel Prahalad article from the Harvard Business Review of a strategic intent being more than simply unfettered ambition. It gives a really clear sense stability in that ambition over time, something which will motivate further ambition, sense of urgency, desire for competition, some really useful pieces. But ultimately this idea that you're looking to create new space rather than necessarily existing industry space. And a school then defining its strategic intent in this sense, recognising COVID's increased the pace and urgency of the digital revolution, committing to engage staff in training for the world of tomorrow, empowering staff to innovate with technology. And note there, again, we're trying to move away from potentially AI, which has a slightly broader sense. A school that reviews projects regularly and shares and aims, and this is obviously the big punt, a school that aims to ensure all pupils are futures-thinking digital natives by 2030.
Looking at a very brief SWOT analysis, I think interestingly some of the key ones are looking at present. It tends to focus and prefer those sort of STEM-based systems. So whether a well-structured right and wrong. I think probably something we need to be mindful of when we're looking at implementing it is certainly this idea here that potential key stakeholders in the school might be more conservative. And as part of that, there's almost certainly a current SLT knowledge gap. And with regards to opportunities and threats, something we need to keep an eye on is the teacher in all of this. And there's that potential for positive change in the teacher, also spend more time doing the more effective things and less time marking, arguably, as the literature states. But also there's that perceived threat from some teachers as well that the robots are taking over, so that will need to be carefully managed. Clear benefits here. And obviously there's potentially one when it comes to the non-teaching side of things and the administrative aspect too. The ethical side with regards to the threats as the implementation is an interesting one. 20 odd years since the last set of criteria or sort of ethical guidance for artificial intelligence was implemented. So that's something that needs to be minded when we are implementing at our setting. Similarly with anything to do with technology, big data and safeguarding.
So how do we think would be the best way to go about leading a change like this in a school like the one we're discussing? Well, I think the first thing to say is that there isn't a model out there that really captures the complexity of leading change in any school, or particularly a school like this one. Fulham is a good place to start. Widely cited theorist, somebody who's been very influential in popularising ideas around the learning organisation in schools and in education. And his idea that you need to initiate the change and then institutionalise it gradually, it's a long-term process, is important. There's going to be people who are early adopters of the change, as Rogers would put it, other people who are going to take a lot longer to embrace the change. And there's going to be a lot of resistance, and you've got to proactively engage with that and think carefully about individual teachers' theory of action, as Robertson puts it, and how are you going to engage with that and bring them with you, unpick that resistance. So it's going to be an iterative change. It's going to be hugely complex because schools are complex organisations. It's probably going to be a cyclical process as you gradually embed iterative changes at a time. And it's going to be about a high trust aspirational culture where staff are continually learning. I really like this quote from Toby Greene. And it's going to be a collaborative endeavour with small incremental changes all being brought together. And I think as you're thinking about the changes, it's really, really important to think about the stakeholders. The open system diagram that Leverchich has put together is a really useful point of departure here. Some key people that you need to think about: students, staff, parents, and I think you also need to think about in the open system the policy environment as well. So in the context of this high autonomy, high accountability policy environment that independent schools are currently working in with this scrutiny sledgehammer, I like that quote, and a lot of policy churn, so a great deal of uncertainty. You've got staff who are going to be saying, first of all, they might misconceive what you're trying to achieve. They are pressured, hugely pressured for time. There are safeguarding issues to think about with students. There are ethical issues. There are problems created about students being better at the technology than the adults who are trying to safeguard them. And I think one thing that really characterises the independent sector is parent accountability. They're paying fees, and the research that's out there shows that parents exert a much more considerable influence on our sector than they do the rest of the school system in the UK. And the lack of familiarity with AI, or worse, the kind of misunderstanding of what role it should play and a kind of misguided pressure that they might exert there is something that we really need to think about.
Moving on to look at resourcing, and much of the literature does stress that there are significant longer-term cost benefits from implementing AI, but implementation is likely to incur some very high short-term setup costs. It's important to remember that fee inflation since the 1990s has been driven significantly by technological change. And it's also important to emphasize that there's a tendency for our sector to enter damaging arms races with building better and better facilities without really thinking about the educational benefit of those, and it might be that AI falls into this particular trap. And early adopters might pursue very expensive technological dead ends until we have a better understanding of AI's effectiveness. Those costs, of course, include software, hardware, IT professionals, staff training, and so on. But it's clear that absorption costing, as Simpkins calls it, is going to be required, measuring both those direct and indirect costs of implementation. And off-the-shelf educational IT systems are not always appropriate for our sector. They're often developed for that large state sector market, and quite expensive sector-specific systems have to be developed. And those costs of bespoke AI systems can reach six figures, very expensive. Simpkins notes that the value of cost analysis is limited without a clear understanding of the benefits, and I think my conclusion is that we really don't know those benefits clearly yet, and therefore a clear cost analysis of using AI in our sector is very, very difficult to do.
So looking now at how we're going to take things forward in terms of the development of AI, we're very aware that this is not going to be a linear journey. We're working in an open system with unknown opportunities and risks, with multiple choices and options that are likely to be available to us, where we're reliant on the technological developments made by others. We anticipate needing to work in a data-rich environment where many of the benefits of AI will be overhyped. So key to our success here is our ability to make effective decisions. And looking at how we might use evidence to inform our decision making, it's useful to think of the types of evidence that we likely to encounter. So academic research is likely to be quite profound in this area. It seems ripe for an area of academic research within the universities. We can anticipate there'll be practitioner research that we can undertake within our school, but we also anticipate there being lots of research presented to us by those that are developing the AI solutions. They will have access to huge amounts of big data on our students and students from across the world or across the country, which will allow them to mine and carry out analysis and make claims. And we'll need to look at our ability to understand and challenge some of those findings. Within the school, we'll be able to develop more formal data. Schools are very data rich anyway, and we run the risk of overload here, but our staff will need the skills to be able to interpret this data along with all the other data that they deal with. And I think it's very easy to overlook the importance of informal data, observations, discussions, interviews with our staff, with our students, and the role that can play to help us integrate AI into the teaching and learning experience for our students. That's going to be key to the success of the deployment of AI within our school. So the theme here is really around the skill sets our staff will need to develop to actually understand and interpret this evidence.
So in timeline terms, I've always liked the backward design work. Started with Tyler in 49 and developed by Wiggins McTighe in 2005, conceptually lining up alongside the strategic intent piece of, what are you trying to do? What is the evidence that you're going to use in order to evaluate that? And then actually the last thing you do is the first thing you will do, which is sort of plan your learning experience. So we've already defined in our strategic intent earlier on that the school we're talking about aims to ensure all pupils are futures thinking digital natives by 2030. What's the sort of evidence that we might then look to use as we go backwards? So staff projects and innovations, definitely capacity for creating an innovation fund, that sort of thing. Pupil impact surveys, staff discussions and TLCs, so in line with Dylan Williams' thinking around teacher learning communities. So all the things that are coming out of that obviously are the evidence that we'll be using to consider our progress. And so what then might be the progress steps? Well, we start with sort of easy and cheap esports development, that sort of process, perhaps beginning with some sense of competition, but being able to move on to assessment. Some of you may have come across the Pearson BTEC in esports. That is sort of secondary phase. You can see I'm running at sort of 2 years out, assessment development, working with people like Century Tech. And again, there's a progress journey you can make there. Begin with extra maths, move on to perhaps all maths and developing then into science and English and all those sorts of things. And those of you that are familiar with platforms like Century Tech will see that as you develop your use of those, so actually they also begin not only to take on the assessment side, but to begin to take on instruction. So that becomes a sort of longer term aim of where the market where we may be going, where the school may be heading.